we have failed to invest in our own defense. And as a result, you've got a White House who can pretty much throw their weight around. And that is hugely regrettable because we've got somebody in the White House who's been okay when you've had presidents who understand the difference between right and wrong and have some sort of moral clarity about it. But unfortunately, we've got a president who rolls out the red carpet for an internationally indicted war criminal in Putin.
President Trump's calls to end the war in Ukraine, would you believe, have fallen on deaf ears with Vladimir Putin. Moscow's latest deadly attack on Kyiv killed more than 20 people on Wednesday night. It's been condemned by the White House, although we are waiting for the US president to speak about it himself. Calls are now growing for tougher financial sanctions to be imposed on Russia. Joining us now, Sir Grant Shapps, former Defence Secretary and Conservative MP. Good morning to you.
Morning.
When we say that the calls for peace have fallen on deaf ears, was there ever really going to be another outcome from that weekend a couple of weeks ago, which felt filled with activity towards peace, but Putin didn't seem all that eager?
Yeah, I think just to speak completely bluntly, that Trump has had the wool pulled over his eyes by Putin. Trump has been incredibly naive about Putin's intentions, which have always been to continue this war. And, furthermore, and I think probably more worrying than, Trump's naivety, has been the fact that he thought that it was okay to deal with a dictator invading a democracy in the same way, or perhaps giving him more, actually a lot more respect than he gave to the democratic country and the democratic president that had his country invaded. And I think that should worry us all.
To what extent does the British Council being damaged in these most recent strikes, to what extent does that change the dynamic of this thing? Should we be re-evaluating the UK's position given this British Council was damaged, was targeted almost?
Well, I mean, there are risks in being, having, facilities like the British Council in country, a country that is being attacked. On the other hand, the last thing we should do is run away from our friends who are being attacked and say, well, look, guys, you're on your own. And, President Zelensky showed that incredible leadership. And I know it's now, you have to go back to 2022, the early days of this war, when the Americans and everyone really was encouraging him to sort of seek safe passage. But he stayed in Ukraine, he stayed in Kyiv. And actually, I think that sets the example. I don't think we should be leaving the country, but it is a country at war. And as I say, it's why I find it so disturbing that the leader of the free world in the US president doesn't seem to understand who the aggressor is and who the victim is in this war.
You've actually described it, haven't you, as Trump is dancing to Putin's tune, which makes me question, Mr. Shapps, where we are at as the UK and as European leaders more broadly with influencing Trump, with changing the music.
Well, he's a difficult person to influence, and that's why the best thing that we can possibly do is ensure that we can look after our own defence on our own continent. I mean, I think it is, indignity, beyond parallel, perhaps not beyond parallel, because you can look back to the First and Second World Wars, but it is indignity that we cannot decide the future, our boundaries, our borders of countries on our own continent. And that's only happened because over many, many years, we have failed to invest in our own defense. And as a result, you've got a White House who can pretty much throw their weight around. And that is hugely regrettable because, we've got somebody in the White House who's been okay when you've had presidents who understand the difference between right and wrong and have some sort of moral clarity about it. But unfortunately, we've got a president who rolls out the red carpet for an internationally indicted war criminal in Putin, and then abuses, or prior to that, abuses the democratic president of Ukraine. And when you've got that situation, Europe finally has woken up to this and realised why it needs to defend itself.
Yeah. What then of this reporting from Politico that European leaders are considering the creation of a 40-kilometre buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian front lines as part of a peace deal? They describe it, in fact, as a last-ditch idea that Moscow has embraced that would likely stretch the number of peacekeeping troops actually required. And as an add to this, the US doesn't appear to be involved in any buffer zone discussions. Could this work?
Well, I don't trust actually anything that Putin agrees to, because he is very clear. He wants the entirety of Ukraine to be its so-called buffer zone for Russia, and that is just fundamentally wrong. People in Ukraine want to be, European. They want to be Western European. They should have the right to decide on their own futures. So could that work? Well, look, it would depend on a whole bunch of factors, not least the extent to which the US prepared to provide intelligence, what's called ISR in military terms. It's the ability to look at what's going on, have some really significant threats over Russia if it overstepped. I don't see any of those things being likely with this particular president in the White House, because he buys the Putin line. He rolls out the red carpet for Putin, and he's been strung along with Putin. Remember all that stuff about having the war done in 24 hours? Here we are, getting on for a year after he was elected, come November, and okay, since January in office, and we don't see this war coming to an end. In fact, the kind of level of drone attacks, missile attacks on Ukraine from Russia have, if anything, increased massively.
Yeah. What does it say about the UK? If Trump is being strung along, how would you describe the UK's connection to that? Are we also, by extension, dancing to Putin's tune?
Oh, we are to some extent, though much less willingly, I think is the answer. And look, I think it puts the British government in an incredibly difficult position. And for what it's worth, although I'm obviously not a great fan of this current Labour government in the UK, I actually think that Starmer has played his hand as well as he could do, given the hand he was sort of served with regard to his dealings with Trump. So I sort of keep this away from the politics of it, but I think that in the end, years of underinvestment, and this obviously applies to all political parties, in our military, particularly since the fall of the Cold War, have led to a moment where we can't make decisions about our own continent, in our own continent, and instead you've got somebody an ocean away who doesn't share apparently our democratic values, and by the way, actually is charging Ukraine for its own defense in a way that we haven't charged Ukraine for their defense. Europe has defended Ukraine with weapons and support because we know it's the right thing to do. Not so this White House.
Every time we talk in these sorts of terms, Grant Shapps, with any of our guests really, listeners get in touch and question why the UK and Europe and the US haven't sanctioned Russia into the dust. Why is there still any headroom for an intensification of sanctions at all? If we were serious about this would have been done a long time ago. Why isn't it being done now? Can you help us understand that?
Yeah, and I think your listeners are right. I think that when maybe it's because of the application of sort of international law, and as you know, the UK in particular can be a stickler on this kind of stuff. And I think we need to shift our approach. The issue is that I think if you should always have the right of your own capital and assets and invested in other countries, unless you go and invade a democratic neighbor. And I think at that point, you should lose those rights. And I know we had extensive discussions about it when I was defense secretary, when I was in government, and came to the conclusion that if you couldn't do this acting as a single country, you had to do it with some sort of global agreement. Otherwise, you end up not solving the problem at scale. And of course, again, the problem is now we've got a president in the White House who doesn't even have any intention of doing so. Although I have to say, he can be pretty schizophrenic on these things. The way he has just effectively sanctioned India for continuing to buy Russian oil, I think is absolutely the right approach. He's added 50%, tariffs to India. The problem is it's done with such lack of clarity. You don't really know whether he's done that because he really cares that India are buying the Russian oil, or simply because it's a trade move and he thinks he can get away with it and put tariffs up against India for his own domestic reasons. Yeah. So, but no, it should be done. There's billions of dollars worth of assets that we could freeze, and then we could give it to Ukraine, and they can help to fight their own war. And probably at about $250 billion, it can make a substantial difference in that war.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time, Sir Grant Shapps. It's good to speak to you.
Pleasure.
Sir Grant Shapps is a former Defence Secretary and Conservative MP, of course. There is a question about how performative all of this is and whether your patience with that is running thin, to be honest. The summoning of Russia's ambassador. And when we talk about sanctions in all of that, the EU has imported €297 billion worth of Russian goods since January 2022. So while it has to be said the number has come down, it's still pretty high.
There's still trade there.
Happening. It's still happening.
Thanks for your messages on this. Mark's got in touch saying, surely our slavish devotion to sucking up to America has got us into the position we're in now. All we have ever got from across the Atlantic is greed and cost.
And this one is from Kevin, who says not only is the USA charging Ukraine for the weapons, but they're only selling them the old weapons that they had stockpiled and were about to be scrapped.